If recent propaganda about atrocities in Syria sound familiar, that's because they are. Before the Duma chemical attack, there was Libya in 2011, and before that, Iraq, and before that, a regime change war almost now forgotten. But those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. RT's Yulia Shapalapova reminds us of Yugoslavia.
On the 24th of March 1999, NATO's military campaign against Yugoslavia began. It was called a humanitarian intervention to stop repressive activities of the government of Slobodan Milosevic. Yugoslavia called it an illegal act of aggression against a sovereign country that was in violation of international law because it did not have UN Security Council support.
We must act now.
A call to take out Slobodan Milosevic.
This is not a battle for territory. This is a battle for humanity.
The Operation Allied Force lasted for 11 weeks. NATO launched 2,300 missiles at 990 targets. 14,000 bombs were dropped. More than 300 schools, factories, hospitals, bridges, industrial plants and military installations were destroyed. Over 2,000 civilians, including 88 children, were killed and 8,000 people wounded. Almost the entire territory of the former Yugoslavia was bombed. The balance of forces was clearly not in favor of the Serbs back then. On the one hand, a powerful NATO group consisting of hundreds of aircraft and the latest weaponry. On the other, a few dozen planes and all Soviet-era defenses.
Military action.
It has attacked a sovereign state.
Waves of planes are taking off.
NATO cruise missiles land in Serbia.
When the country collapsed in 1992, the Serbs were dragged into inter-ethnic territorial wars provoked by those who dreamed of destroying a strong Yugoslav state in the south of Europe. The territorial conflict between Croatia and the Serbian Krajina, as well as the civil war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the Muslim armed forces were opposed by the Serbian Volunteer Guard, lasted from 1991 to 1995. The Western media never reported about crimes against the Serbs. They only portrayed their opponents as victims, closing their eyes on atrocities committed by Croats and Bosnians who burned Serbian villages and killed civilians. As a result of the NATO bombing campaign, Serbian forces withdrew from Kosovo. In 1999 and 2000, ethnic cleansing committed by the Albanians began. They destroyed Serbian villages and Orthodox churches, while UN peacekeepers didn't prevent them from doing so. More than 200,000 ethnic Serbs were forced to flee their homes in Kosovo. Today, the largest US military base in Europe is located there. In 2008, Kosovo declared its independence from Serbia.
For more on this, we go to RT producer Nebojsa Malik. Neb, you were there at the time of the war. Can you tell viewers about that experience and explain under what or by what justification NATO became involved?
Well, I was there for the first part of it, for the Bosnia part. I was observing the propaganda about the Kosovo war from the U.S. At the time, their justification was there's horrible humanitarian suffering going on, there's refugees, there's an evil dictator bombing his own people, we must intervene. Sure, we don't have UN authorization, but that's okay, a higher moral imperative dictates it, and they call this responsibility to protect, R2P. And they even had this international commission, the ad hoc collected one, call it. It was illegal, but it was legitimate, so everything's fine. The international tribunal that was also ad hoc that was set up for Bosnia refused to basically prosecute anybody in NATO for any sort of violations of war crimes or violations of the customs of war, because they said, well, NATO said they didn't do anything wrong and we'll take their word for it. And just like that, it was legalized in the court of public opinion, but that's what happens when you only have one court of public opinion.
Right. What is the significance of Yugoslavia? Why would NATO have an interest there?
There's multiple intersectional lines there. There's political of, well, we don't want a country that is strong and multi-ethnic and socialist. That was early 90s. And then later on it was, oh, well, we don't want somebody who's allied to Russia, which was the perception in the West about the Serbs. And after the war, you had some Washington insiders who were endorsed by highfalutin figures in the State Department even say, oh, this whole thing, the Kosovo war, was a message to Russia that, you know, don't you dare. And of course, the Russians took the lesson exactly the opposite of what the U.S. intended. You can hear frequently President Vladimir Putin mentioning Yugoslavia, the bombing in '99, the NATO aggression as an example of why the West can't be trusted.
Secretary of State at the time, Madeleine Albright, is currently on book tour to promote her new book on fascism. You find this a little bit ironic. Why?
Very much so. Well, see, the funny thing is that Albright was actually saved from fascism by the people of Yugoslavia. She was the daughter of a Czech ambassador to Belgrade. The family was helped both in the run-up of World War II as well as after the war, when there was a dispute between the Czech government and the Soviet Union. And Albright came back to the Balkans figuratively in the 90s and led this whole effort. She was one of the big driving forces as the Secretary of State to bomb Serbia, to attack Yugoslavia over Kosovo, to the point where U.S. media dubbed it Albright's War, and she was having her pictures taken in a bomber jacket and applauded and praised, and look how tough she is. And there's photos of her kissing ethnic Albanian rebels in this French chateau where the sham negotiations were taking place. I mean, she was all over this thing. And this was after she said that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. And she's never been called to account for it. And now she's talking about fascism? That's really ironic.
Finally, in about the 45 seconds we have left, people might wonder, why do we need to sit here and have this history lesson? What can you explain why it's significant to study what happened in Yugoslavia?
Because, as the great historian once said, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. Because Yugoslavia has been memory hold, because the whole thing from the 90s has been memory hold, you can have these things happening in Syria today that are taken straight from the Yugoslavia propaganda textbook, just identical false flag attacks, accusations of this, that, and the other, unverified reports being shared by media and to create a pretense that there's something there when there isn't. All of these things are super important to remember that this has been done before, and they intend to do it again.
It all comes back to that R2P, responsibility to protect doctrine. RT producer Naboja Malik, thanks so much.